following presentation is an Delmarva Studios production.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to another edition of the Flat Earth Files. As always, I am your host, George, and I hope everyone is doing well this holiday season as we enter into Christmas and the New Year's, and we'll see what 2023 has in store for us. I'm blown away. I'd like to start out by saying I'm just absolutely blown away by the amount of downloads we had already. Normally, anytime you start a new podcast, it takes quite a long time to get any sort of following, and it's amazing how quickly the Flat Earth Files podcast has grown. So I tip my hat to you. Thank you for the continued support. And once again, if you do have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to write us the old electronic mail, aka email, at theflatearthfiles@gmail.com. Again, that is theflatearthfiles@gmail.com. I actually wasn't going to do a podcast today, but I was searching through the old internet today. I came across a very, very interesting article that was published back in 2015 on the website The Liberty Beacon, and I thought it was pretty good because I've covered much of this stuff on the Fact Hunter podcast that I do. I must have done this episode probably a year ago, talking about Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard and the occult side of NASA. And of course, this episode, is entitled "NASA Never a Straight Answer." And NASA is very much an illusion. So a magician is always uses sleight of hand, right? And that's what the rulers of this world do to deceive us. It's sleight of hand. And NASA is one of the most important tools that the controllers, the hidden hand, or whatever you want to call them, use, because people buy into NASA. And NASA wouldn't exist if you don't believe in the heliocentric model, right? If there's a firmament, then there's no such thing as going into space. So NASA is an extremely important tool for the controllers. And if we can expose the holes in that story, well, then we're certainly we're making some leaps and bounds for Team Good Guy, right? That's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to wake people up as fast as we can. And I'm actually, the next podcast I'm recording on the Fact Hunter is entitled 2023, What's in Store for the Future. And I do believe the hidden hand, the controllers, the Illuminati, the NWO, whatever you want to call them, have some serious tricks up their sleeve. And I believe that they're going to start very early out of the chute. I think January 6th, 2023 will be a big day in American history. We'll see. I'm not a prophet, right? I can't see into the future. But when you get older and you kind of see their playbook, you can kind of sense when they are going to throw something at us. And if you've been paying any attention to the media, you'll see that they referred Donald to the Department of Justice. I think it's within the next, what's today? The 19th. Within the next 2 weeks, certainly you'll see, I believe you'll see Diney in handcuffs, and in turn you'll see a false flag by the controllers, and they'll blame it on, crazy Trump supporters, and you'll see something I like to call the Patriot let's try that again. The Patriot Modernization Act of 2023. I think they'll take the Patriot Act and just clamp down more on people. By the way, if you didn't see, if you're on Twitter, Elon Musk, who again is just part of the show, he's a puppet in the show. All these people who are on the world stage are actors, and they have their parts to play. There's rumors that Jared Kushner could be the new CEO, but with that being said, Elon Musk is enforcing like a social credit score to people's Twitter's accounts. So if you think this guy who champions putting chips in your brain is a noble guy, I would think twice before I put too much stock into Elon Musk. Okay, so with that being said, let's get on with this really interesting article that I found. It's The Occult Roots of NASA and the Ongoing Fraud. Again, this was in the Liberty Beacon website, dated August 7th, 2015. And it's starts like this. In my lexicon, NASA stands for never a straight answer. If you ever happen to start poking around NASA and the Apollo moon landings, a keen eye and open mind will bring to the conclusion that it was a staged hoax. And that, my friends, is the key. Getting our friends and family and neighbors to start looking at things with an open mind. And it is so difficult to unprogram or deprogram, whatever the proper terminology is, someone's brain who has been part of the indoctrination progress for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years, right? In fact, the pure hard scientific evidence and analysis irrevocably reveals the fraud among many. Think about that. The greatest feat accomplished by man is an elaborate Hollywood production that cost the American taxpayer a cool $30 billion. Imagine what James Cameron could create with a budget like that. But to be quite frank, it pisses me off more that NASA has built up a money-sucking colossus composed of lies, hoaxes, and misinformation. The American taxpayer derives virtually no benefit from NASA's existence, and alleged scientific contributions derived by supposed explorations and experiments in space. And again, on JPL's website from 2012, there's a picture of supposedly the little rover on Mars, and there's a picture of a mouse on Mars. That was obviously taken in Greenland or some desert somewhere, right? It's just an absolute joke. And there's no benefit from NASA whatsoever. It's all a production. You know, the whole story, how they flew that refrigerator-sized deal onto an asteroid, blew it up, saved Earth, it's all a joke. It's all a laugh. If we live on a flat plane with a firmament, there's nothing coming from above that can harm us except if we piss God off. But we have the covenant. But, the flood. Anyway, I'm getting a little too far off. Continue. Absent of any other sources to verify it, we have to prostrate ourselves from the so-called experts, despite irrefutable evidence that NASA is nothing more than an elaborate financial embezzler and pseudoscience peddler. And then you can look at Bill Nye, the lying guy, and his friend, I can't think of his name off the top of my head. He's the guy who does all the science stuff, and makes all the appearances on the TV shows. I'm thinking of Neil deGrasse Tyson. I had to pause the show. It was driving me crazy. Neil deGrasse Tyson. That's what happens when you get old, folks. But one thing you'll find in common with the Bill Nyes and the Neil deGrasse Tysons is they're basically atheists. When they talk about spirituality, he's just saying a connection with the cosmos. He's not a follower of Christ whatsoever. These people are just absolute frauds. They're pseudoscience peddlers. So again, in short, once fraud is detected, everything that sits upon it is now in question, right? So if they lied about us going to the moon, then everything should be in play, right? Your credibility is done. Who would disagree with the logic of fraud, right? Fraud destroys the validity of everything. It's reasonable, predictable, and has the power to instantly change the direction of one's perception, even those that were once held sacred. And again, guys, you look at every single movie almost in Hollywood history, you're going at some point in, whether it's for 2 seconds or for several shots, there is a globe in just about every single movie ever made. Ever made. Okay? Fraud has no limits by those who engage in it, and it's been around for a long time. Do you think the real fraudsters stop at just one fraud? Of course not. Or do you think they keep going and going until they die or get caught? The problem is, folks, is they control everything. So even if they get caught, they'll pull it out of the news cycle real quick with something else. Back in the day, back in the 80s, the news stories would be in the news cycle for 2 weeks. I remember back in 1985 when the Philadelphia police burnt down an entire city block when they, had the standoff with MOVE. That was in the newspaper on the front page every day for almost 2 weeks. Now the news cycle is so 24/7. Some things, even things that are considered large-scale stories, may only be in the news cycle for a day or two, unless it's Trump or that whole January 6th event. The answer is simple. Why would you ever stop lucrative fraudulent activity like NASA if you haven't been caught? So the chance for systematic fraud, once initial fraud is found, becomes a virtual certainty. Now, to further muddy the waters, NASA was founded by satanic worshiping occultists and black magicians. This is not idle rumor. This is fact. NASA is a military, Hollywood, pseudoscience, satanic cartel whose true aim is to use taxpayer funding to promote and profit by developing and deploying pseudoscience technology and methodology. The first fraud, in our opinion, is the true origins of NASA and the cast of characters that had significant influence. Go to NASA and search for them, and you'll find whitewashed bios, or you really won't find any information. So let's start with pre-NASA. So the predecessor to NASA was a young, talented rocket scientist by the name of Jack Parsons. Now, Warner von Braun claimed it was the self-taught Parsons, not himself, who was the true father of the American space program for his contribution to the development of solid rocket fuel. You know, JPL is now called the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. It used to be the Jack Parsons Laboratory. So JPL, they just changed his name out of, they took his name and changed it to Jet Propulsion. Now, the story goes that Jack's childhood was one of solitude, loneliness, but wealth. He had wealth. He could sit in his room all day and read, never worrying about supporting his family or where his next meal was going to come from. He ferociously read Jules Verne, including his 1865 novel From Earth to the Moon, and the new sci-fi magazine Amazing Stories. So soon, space wasn't just what was above Jack's head, it became a romantic obsession. One day, Jack was getting pummeled at school when an older boy swooped in and put an end to the bleeding. That boy's name was Ed Foreman, and he would become Jack's best friend into his adult years and would go on to play an essential player in Jack's rocket dreams. Ed and Jack whiled away days talking about the science fiction books they were reading, and soon they began experimenting on their own. Using Ed's father's engineering tools and resources and supplies, Jack took from his part-time job at the Hercules Powder Company. They would build explosives. Teachers and Jack's mother began worrying about him, but Ed and Jack continued to experiment. Fast forward to 1934. Jack's 20 years old now. The duo's interest in rockets went from a child's fantasy into an academic pursuit when, despite not being students there, they gained the support of the close-by California Institute of Technology. Ed, Jack, and several members of Caltech's community formed the Galset Rocket Research Group. Halloween, 1936, odd day of choice, no? The group performed their first motor test near the Devil's Gate Dam in Pasadena. The motor exploded, but soon they became infamous on campus. And you'll never guess what name they inherited that day. Well, if you're a fan of the comics, you may have heard it. They were called the Suicide Squad. So when you hear these movie references, they're tipping the hat to the father of the occult, Jack Parsons. They were supposedly called that due to the danger and perceived craziness of their experiments, particularly as, rocket technology at the time was considered to be foolish and mere science fiction in terms of any practical use and the development of technology. So this Suicide Squad was the beginnings of the famed Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the institution responsible for the Mars rover landing and many other advancements in rockets and robotic sciences. Obviously, Parsons was a real talent with a seemingly innate sense of propulsion and rocketry, which at the time was very nascent at the time, but were coveted by the military-industrial complex. You know, you could take explosives, and send them to another battlefield, you know, hundreds or thousands of miles away. So the military-industrial complex became very interested very quickly. And his design and understanding of the chemical composition of liquid rocket was considered without peer. Parsons cut a path as a dashing figure with a reputation as a rocket hotshot and risk-taker. You would think all this scientific achievement would be enough for one person in one lifetime. But Parsons had much loftier sets of ambitions. He wanted to tear down the walls of space and time, and he had an entirely non-scientific set of ideas on how he would do it. The non-scientific set of ideas were steeped in the occult, in Satanism, and black magic. Parsons swore the oath of the abyss, having only the choice between madness, suicides, and that oath. Then he took the oath of the Magister Templi, and even the oath of the Antichrist, before Frater 132, the unknown God, and thus was Antichrist loosed in the world. And to this I am pledged, that the work of the beast 666 shall be fulfilled. And I guess with that, he thought he was, the Antichrist. But apparently, this is interesting. I've never really thought of this. If you note that the Antichrist is only a few letters away from anarchist. And of course, that word anarchist has many meanings, right? Some people call themselves anarchists to where we don't need any government. Other people look at it as someone who wants to terrorize the world, right? But the manifesto that follows is in large part an exhortation of do what thou wilt. And that, of course, is the famous saying by Aleister Crowley. In most things, bodily fluid drenched, economic or political, the goal of all these efforts, according to Metzger, was to bring the apocalypse about, since in theory, things can only get better from there. So by now, many of you are thinking, what a load of crap, right? But the FBI, none too keen about the notion that Parsons' taxpayer-funded salary might be supporting the Antichrist and the hastening of the apocalypse, they purportedly took it seriously enough to open an investigation. And what I'm guessing is many, as happens all the time with the FBI, they'll go in and they'll infiltrate something like this, and then they'll use it to their benefit. See January 6th. Documents recently revealed through the Freedom of Information Act make up 130 pages of heavily redacted text in which the government agents try to make sense of Parsons' religious beliefs and document his frequently careless handling of classified materials. Perhaps Errol Flynn persona fitted Jack Parsons best. But truth be told, Jack Whiteside Parsons is best known for his occultist ideas, black magic, and reverence to the satanic agenda. But Parsons had a secret life, which apparently appeared totally at odds with the public one. And it came to further dominate his life as the 1940s progressed. Jack Parsons and his wife Helen had come into contact with the Agape Lodge of the OTO, which is the Ordo Templi Orientis, which is an international magical fraternity in Los Angeles in 1939, and then he joined it in 1941. And it was under the leadership of Wilfred Talbot Smith, a Britisher who had founded this particular lodge about a decade earlier, circa 1930. Smith and Parsons' wife hit it off nicely, and he was soon not much in evidence around the house and the OTO. This latter space was fitted out and even had a copy of the Egyptian Stele of Revealing, which was venerated by followers of the famous magician Aleister Crowley. It was the only such temple in the world at the time which was properly functioning. So now this is when we slowly get into the Freemasonry aspect of it. And don't forget, while we're talking about NASA today, NASA, or pronounced Nasha in Hebrew, the actual definition in Hebrew means to lead astray, to delude, or to morally seduce people, to beguile and to deceive. And then, of course, everyone knows that within the logo of NASA is a serpent's tongue, right? So anyway, back to Aleister Crowley. He was already a 33rd degree Freemason at the time. He was the world head of the OTO. And he took action that increased Parsons' stature in the order. Around 1943 to 1944, he convinced Smith, via a paper entitled, quote, "Is Smith a God?" that astrological research had shown that Smith was not a man, but actually an incarnation of some deity. Taking the hint that Crowley wanted him out, the god went into private magical practice, eventually with reportedly rewarding results, and remaining head of the lodge in name only. Parsons at that time had lost his wife to Smith, yet remained on good terms with her. He was kept busy by order activities, one of the most important of which was sending the money to Crowley for both the old man's minimal upkeep and the OTO publishing fund. A good percentage came from Parsons' own pocket. Crowley, who brought actual fame to the OTO, which was already a well-known entity in the Masonic circles, was one of Parsons' major inspirations in life. The elderly man's accomplishments had been many. As a poet, a publisher, mountain climber, chess master, and bisexual practitioner of sexual magic, or magic with a K, as he termed it. Made famous by yellow journalists as the wickedest man in the world, he considered his central identity to be the great beast 666, as referred to in the book of Revelation in the Bible, though he was not leaning on that work particularly in his religious ideas. According to most accounts, when Parsons' father died in the early 1940s, Parsons inherited a mansion and coach house at 1003 South Orange Grove Avenue in Pasadena, California. To the shock of the neighbors, the place became a haven for both bohemians and atheists, who were the sort of people to whom Parsons liked to rent out rooms. Now, the lodge headquarters was moved to this location, making use of 2 rooms in the house: the bedroom, which had become a properly decorated temple, and a wood-paneled library dominated by an enormous portrait of Aleister Crowley. Now, according to a story told by L. Sprague de Camp, which most recently appeared in the June 24th, 1990 LA Times, at one point the police, who had heard neighbors' reports of a ritual in which a pregnant woman jumped 9 times through a fire in the yard, came to investigate, but Parsons put them off by emphasizing his scientific credentials. Now, this is the part where L. Ron Hubbard, of course, of the books, anybody who was of age in the 80s, remember all those Dianetic commercials. So they say he was the greatest humanitarian in history. But of course, there was another side to this imaginative and intelligent man. And to understand Scientology, one must begin with L. Ron Hubbard. In the late 1940s, Hubbard was broke and in debt. A struggling writer of science fiction and fantasy, he was forced to sell his typewriter for $28.50 just to get by. Quote, "I can still see Ron 3 steps at a time running up the stairs in around 1949 in order to borrow $30 from me to get out of town because he had a wife after him for alimony." And that was from his former literary agent, Forrest Ackerman. At one point, Hubbard was reduced to begging the Veterans Administration to let him keep a $51 overpayment of benefits. That's how difficult times were for L. Ron Hubbard at the time. Quote, "I am nearly penniless." He was a former Navy lieutenant. Hubbard was mentally troubled too. In late 1947, he asked the VA to help him get psychiatric treatment. Quote, "Toward the end of my military service, I avoided out of pride any mental examinations, hoping that time would balance a mind which I had every reason to suppose was seriously affected. I cannot account for nor rise above long periods of moroseness and suicidal inclinations, and have newly come to realize that I must first triumph above this before I can hope to rehabilitate myself at all." In his most private moments, Hubbard wrote bizarre statements to himself in notebooks that would surface 4 decades later in Los Angeles Superior Court. Quote, "All men are your slaves," he wrote in one. In another, he wrote, "You can be merciless whenever your will is crossed, and you have the right to be merciless." And indeed, Hubbard was troubled, restless, and adrift in those little-known years of his life. However, one thing he never lost confidence in was his abilities as a writer. He had made a living with words in the past, and he could do it again. Before the financial and emotional problems that consumed him in the 1940s, Hubbard had achieved moderate success writing for a variety of dime store pulp magazines. He specialized in shoot-'em-up adventures, westerns, mysteries, war stories, and even, yes, science fiction. He was a master sailor, glider pilot, with a reported penchant for eye-catching maneuvers. Now, although Hubbard's health and writing career foundered after the war, he remained a virtual factory of ideas, and his biggest was about to be born. Hubbard had long been fascinated with the mental phenomena and the mysteries of life. He was an expert in hypnotism. During a 1948 gathering of science fiction buffs in Los Angeles, he hypnotized many of those in attendance, convincing one young man that he was cradling a tiny kangaroo in his hands. Hubbard's intense curiosity about the mind's power led him into a friendship in 1946 with rocket fuel scientist John Whiteside Parsons. Parsons was a protege of British Satanist Aleister Crowley and leader of a black magic group modeled after Crowley's infamous occult lodge in England. Hubbard also admired Crowley, and a 1952 lecture described him as my very good friend. Parsons and Hubbard soon lived in the Agen Mansion on South Orange Grove Avenue in Pasadena. And again, the estate was home to an odd mix of bohemian artists, writers, scientists, and occultists. A small dome temple supported by 6 stone columns stood in the backyard. Hubbard would meet his second wife, Sarah Northrop, at the mansion. Now, although she was Parsons' lover at the time, Hubbard was undeterred. He married Northrop before divorcing his first wife. Long before the 1960s counterculture, some residents of the estate smoked marijuana and embraced a philosophy of promiscuous and ritualistic sex. Crowley's biographers have written that Parsons and Hubbard practiced sex magic, and as the biographers would tell it, a robed Hubbard chanted incantations while Parsons and his wife-to-be Cameron engaged in sexual intercourse that intended to produce a child with superior intellect and powers. That is the sex magic. And the Red Hot Chili Peppers would write a song about it in the 90s. Now, the ceremony was said to span 11 consecutive nights. There's that number 11 again, guys. Hubbard and Parsons finally had a falling out over a sailboat sales venture that ended up in court between the two of them. Quite the dispute there. Now, in later years, Hubbard would try to distance himself from his embarrassing association with Parsons, who was the founder of a government rocket project at Caltech that later evolved into the famed Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Now, Parsons would die in 1952 when a chemical explosion ripped through his garage. Now, it has been said, and there are lots of people who say or think that he was murdered, that this was not an accident. And there's a lot of information on the internet about it. I use Yandex. You're not going to find much if you use Google or even DuckDuckGo, but if you go to Yandex.com, you'll get some much clearer answers to the things you're looking for. Let's put it that way. Hubbard insisted that he had been working for undercover naval intelligence to break up black magic in America and to investigate links between the occultists and prominent scientists of the Parsons mansion. Hubbard said the mission was so successful that the house was razed and the black magic group was dispersed. But Parsons' widow, Cameron, disputed Hubbard's account in a brief interview with the Times. She said the two men, quote, liked each other very much and, quote, felt they were ushering in a force that was going to change things. And change things they did. L. Ron Hubbard went on to create the Church of Scientology, which was a masterpiece and is to this very day of mind control. The Church of Scientology is a vicious and dangerous cult that masquerades as religion. Its purpose is to take money and control people. It practices a variety of mind control techniques on people lured into its midst to gain control over their money and their lives. Its aim is to take from them every penny they have and can ever borrow, and to enslave them to further its wicked ends. Jack Parsons, on the other hand, was a founding member of NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, with some crediting him as being the father of rocketry, and others joking that JPL was actually Jack Parsons' laboratory, as I previously stated. But again, you're not going to find much about him on any of NASA's websites. Parsons' legacy as an engineer and chemist has been somewhat overshadowed by his interest in the occult and has led to what some critics describe as a rewriting of the history books. However strange Parsons was, it did not preclude NASA from naming a crater on the dark side of the moon after him. Of course, one cannot actually see the dark side of the moon, nor confirm that such a crater exists. How appropriate. Quote, America's space program owes much to Parsons' rocket design and innovations. And in 1972, the International Astronomical Union honored him by naming Parsons Crater on the dark side of the moon. After co-founding JPL, which his admirers referred to as Jack Parsons' Laboratory, Parsons would start Aerojet Corporation, now the world's largest rocket producer and manufacturer of solid fuel boosters for space shuttles. Another enigma, which you can find, I didn't spend a lot of time looking, but there are a few articles out there that say that Jack Parsons had a large contribution in the occult design of the Pentagon, which is one thing I never understood, why a government building would be shaped like that. It's just, and then you get into the height of the Washington Monument. It's just all of the architecture in D.C. is very occult, has a very dark occult history behind it. Now, Parsons, who took the oath of the Antichrist in 1949, contributed to the design of the Pentagon under subsequent CIA Director John J. McCloy. And by the way, before I go any further, I should acknowledge the fact, I shouldn't just leave that out there hanging, but if you measure the Washington Monument in inches, it is 6,660 inches. And you can even go to Google for that. Just go to google.com and put in how tall Washington Monument in inches, and you will see that I am not pulling your leg there. But again, Parsons, who took the oath of the Antichrist in 1949, contributed to the designs under subsequent CIA Director John J. McCloy. And it's no coincidence that NASA has been erasing and trying to rewrite its true origins. The mighty pillars of scientific certainty that NASA supposedly sits upon are actually satanic black magicians of the occult. And this is probably a small trivial fact that is most certainly omitted in today's school curriculum, which is why we homeschool. NASA has sprouted from the likes of the self-acclaimed wickedest man in the world, Aleister Crowley, the mass mind control black magician Satanist L. Ron Hubbard, and the uber occultist black magician Satanist Jack Whiteside Parsons to begin the early formation of NASA. In addition to the unholy trinity, there were also two more later additions to the NASA Dream Team, Werner von Braun, who we've spoke about, and 33rd degree Freemason Walt Disney. All the elements were in place to create one of the greatest financial and theological frauds in the history of mankind. So, again, Parsons and Hubbard idolized Aleister Crowley and were avowed Satanists. Taken all together, NASA certainly did not sprout from so-called humble beginnings. L. Ron Hubbard said it best: "You don't get rich writing science fiction. If you want to get rich, start a religion. Fate is not without its ironies." NASA got rich because of science fiction. And for many people, NASA is a religion. One more person that we'll talk about, Ordom Dumoulin, as the capstone to the NASA Dream Team. The adoption of pseudoscience provided the template that makes NASA hoaxers and their rockets go up, and away. NASA didn't have to look far for a sterling example of pseudoscience. The Soviets had perfected the craft of pseudoscience as both the United States and the USSR, as they engaged in the fake Cold War from the end of World War II until, late 80s. And that was just to keep the military-industrial complex fed, folks. The Cold War was pre-engineered by the Khazarian Rothschild Zionist banker after World War II. And, of course, they held financial control of both governments, right? We know that. So today's incarnation of NASA is a military, Masonic-controlled entity that acts as the sole gatekeeper to information about the cosmos and our place in it. To think NASA's black magic and occult origins haven't been refined by Freemasonry, that's just naive. So if you want to delve deeper into secret societies, there's plenty of it on the internet, or you can check out my other podcast, The Fact Hunter. So we'll call it a day there. NASA, comes off as, this great scientific, as we continue to explore, and we hope one day we can have man live on other planets. It's just all science fiction. It's hopium, and it's to keep you away from God. If you sit down and read the Bible and then listen to what NASA says, you'll understand that all of this is a lie. And again, going back to the very beginning of this podcast, it is very difficult to, reprogram folks who have been in the indoctrination process for 20, 30, 50, 70 years. Talking about the 12 years of public education. Listen, even private schools, when you get to the science, they're going to talk about NASA and outer space. They've done such a fine job. Every time you watch a TV show or a movie, there's a globe in there, so your mind perceives it as normal. And when you come up to someone and say, "Hey, bro, the globe is a lie," they're led to believe that is, if you believe in flat Earth, that you're a low IQ individual. And it's just sad that people who are, and look, let me say this. We were all asleep at one time. It's not, we should never look down upon people who are into this, because most of us were all asleep at one time. I know there's some people who say they've been awake since they were born, and if that's the case, God bless you. But all of us at one point, I believe, were asleep. So when we say things like this, sometimes we get carried away. I don't think we should call them sheeple or things like that. It's our job, I feel, to wake them up and to save them, because there's a lot of in the Bible that says trust in God, not in man. And whether you're talking about the scamdemic and the vaccinations, or NASA. It's all a lie to take you away from God, the creator of the earth. And that, NASA says sun is the center of earth, which is very anti-God. God created this. He didn't create the sun first and then build everything around it. He created earth first and then created everything around it. And you were put here at this time because he knew you could handle it. So again, I ask you to pick up the armor of God and spread the message. And I hope you enjoyed this episode. And again, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, it's theflatearthfiles@gmail.com. Thanks for your unbelievable support. I'm overwhelmed at how quickly this podcast has grown. I've never had a show with numbers like this. That's why I get motivated and I try to do more, because it tells me people are getting the message and they're waking up. Please share this with your friends and family. I know, once again, there's no quicker way to lose the respect of your friends and family than to say, hey, the earth's flat. But we have to do things out of our comfort zone right now, folks, if we're going to make it. All right. So with that being said, I think we'll call it a day there. I'm going to try to at least have one more podcast this week. One more, and if not two. So again, thanks for your time. God bless you. Have a great rest of your week. And until the next podcast, my friends, we'll see you.
To the Fact Hunter Radio Network.
Just the facts, ma'am.
Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on ChumbaCasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Coincidence? I think not. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere, even at 30,000 feet. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's ChumbaCasino.com and live the Chumba life.
No purchase necessary. VGW. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
It is Ryan here, and I have a question for you. What do you do when you win? Like, are you a fist pumper, a woohooer, a hand clapper, a high fiver? I kind of like the high five, but if you want to hone in on those winning moves, check out Chumba Casino. At ChumbaCasino.com, choose from hundreds of social casino-style games for your chance to redeem serious cash prizes. There are new game releases weekly, plus free daily bonuses. So don't wait. Start having the most fun ever at ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.